So I'm Stephanie Chasteen. I'm with the Science Education Initiative at the University of Colorado at Boulder. The following is a short video of a workshop that we did for the Faculty Teaching Excellence Program on writing clicker questions. This can be used if you would like to have taken a workshop like this to find out what we talk about, or if you want to give a workshop like this to see how we run it. All of the interactive components, such as participant discussion, have been cut out for reasons of length. So just so you know, those are in there, but they're not included in the video. Enjoy. This workshop will be really focused on writing good clicker questions. So we're going to focus on the questions themselves and not so much on how you actually use it in the classroom, although we'll give you a brief overview of that. Next week, there is another workshop called Making Clickers Work for You that I'll be doing with Steve Pollock in the physics department, and that will be really getting into some of the nitty-gritty of clicker facilitation, making it actually work successfully for you and your students. Now I'm just going to jump in. So we found out a little bit about who you are, but I just want to demonstrate different ways of asking questions. Here's a really familiar one. Can you tell me who here is in the natural sciences? Raise your hands. Social sciences, humanities, arts, 0, etc. So raising your hand is one way to find out a little bit about either what people in the class think or who they are. So that's a common one. Here's another way, which is using clickers. I just want to make sure that we all know how to use the clicker. Make sure to turn it on and tell me whether or not you've used classroom response systems in your teaching. So if you haven't used iClicker before, I have a little sneak preview on the screen of how it is that you've responded before I even show you guys the histogram, which is a really useful feature. I don't care about keeping this one anonymous, so I'll just show you. Or keeping this one, keeping the mystery on the answer on this one. So I'll just show you. Most of you have used them a lot, which is great because this workshop is geared towards, getting sort of deeper into questions. So how familiar are you with Mazur's Pure Instruction? I want to show you the low-tech clicker way. This colored card you can fold to indicate whichever answer choice is your answer choice. And on a count of 3, I'll ask you to vote, and you'll hold it up here. So you can see this is not anonymous to me. I can tell who is voting what. But it's semi-anonymous to your peers, especially if you are all sitting in rows. So let's go ahead and get our answer choices. I'm not going to tell you what what Mazur's Pure Instruction is. You'll just tell me whether or not you know about it. So on the count of 3, 3, 2, 1. And you'll see one aspect of this, which is that it takes the instructor a moment to visually process that information. So we're mostly C's and D's. But this is just, if you're not sure that you want to get into the technology part of clickers yet, this is a good alternative. I think that it's good to use the actual technological clicker that's got a lot of advantages that we'll talk about. But if you're just wanting to give it a shot, really low barrier way. So as Marianne mentioned, I'm with the Science Education Initiative, which is an initiative started by Carl Wyman and the physics department to try to transform science education, treating the teaching of science as a science. So using what we know about teaching and learning to help transform undergraduate education. I'm in the physics education research group, so I do research on student learning in the physics department. And I'm also an external blogger, so if you like reading about teaching and learning stuff, I blog about that a lot on my blog. So let's just briefly think about a few reasons why we question, regardless of clickers. Why do we question our students in class or out of class? A couple of things that gets us.
Keeps the students engaged.
Keeps them engaged, yep. Keeps their brains firing.
It lets us discern how much they're learning or if they have misconceptions.
Yeah, it gives us feedback on their learning. Other reasons? Someone from the APS side?
Can potentially encourage discussion or interaction. Gets them more involved in the lecture.
Gets them more involved. So a question can serve as a spark for discussion with each other. So great. So there's a lot of different reasons why we want to question. Here's like a cartoon indicating one, which sort of goes with your feedback, which is that we don't necessarily know how students have received things that we've talked about, and whether or not they're seeing things or conceiving of things in the way that we think that we've explained it so well. So clickers are a way to have that real-time feedback in your class, and I think a lot of you are familiar with that. So here's sort of my outline for today, which is, we'll talk a little bit about, places in your lecture that you might want to ask questions. We'll talk very briefly about how clickers work to ask questions, just to make sure we're all on the same page. And then we'll really get into the meat of writing questions and look at some example questions and get a chance to write our own. And I've got learning goals for you at the bottom of the page. I always like starting a workshop or a class or anything with what my goals are for the people in that learning experience, because then that helps me target the questions that I ask to help achieve those goals. So that's something to think about for your own life. What goals might clickers be used to achieve? We talked about some general goals of questioning, but just take 2 minutes right now to brainstorm on your own, just on your handout. You can talk to your neighbor if you like. Just 2 minutes. What might you use clicker questions to accomplish in your class? What are a couple of things that came up?
Attendance.
Attendance, okay. So way to track whether or not they're there.
It's often perceived by the students as unfair, but I try to ask them the question before I teach them the material to see if they can logically deduce what the next step is.
So just sort of lead into lecture,
Yeah.
maybe get them thinking about the topic, or
Right, or about how to put together things they have learned, but in a new way.
Nice. Yeah, I like that. That's creative.
Spot check knowledge.
Yeah.
So you can ask questions about what they were supposed to have read for class.
Yep. We often start with a reading quiz or something like that. Yep. Make sure that everyone's where they should be.
Kind of related to that, it's a chance for students to sort of check the act of questioning and answering, and then seeing the other responses gives students a chance to kind of check in and make sure that they're on the same page, and they can do it anonymously. So it's much less, you're more likely to have people give wrong answers and figure out that they gave the wrong answer than just not.
Maybe also to alert the students what the important concepts are, because if they deserve a clicker question, it means it's important.
It's true. It really frames what you value that your students learn. So it's a way of communicating to your students what your goals for them are. And if you ask questions about things that you don't think are important for them to learn, you sort of sent a wrong message.
Sometimes I'm not sure how much further to go with a topic, and so I'll ask a question to see if everyone understands where I want them to be. And if they do, then I'll just skip the next bit of class and move on to something else. But if there's still some confusion, then I'll take the extra time to explore it. So it helps me decide how to organize class.
Great. So maybe at the end of a topic, how are we doing? Can I move on, or do we need to sort of circle back or go deeper into this? Great.
I've tried to use it to get people to talk to each other too, to form groups so that you can have this class of 150 students and none of them talk to each other.
Right.
Yeah, it definitely it serves a sociological
It
purpose.
does. It does.
It breaks up the class too. I mean, I was teasing a bit about the monotony, but it does. They tend to zone, and then it breaks the class up, brings everybody back into.
Change the
Yeah.
pace.
Well, and the other sociological purpose that I think that is sort of relevant there is it's sort of breaking down the barrier. They have a reason to talk to each other. They have to, because they need to click in, and they need to reason through this thing. So if you want that conversation to be happening, this can be a way to reduce that barrier. So I'm going to show you some of you guys came up with great stuff. I'll show you a few of the goals that I think of for clicker questions. It's just one framework of thinking about goals. So some of the goals I have are thinking about it in terms of when in instruction does it happen. One is before instruction. So this ties in very well with what you said. So we want to motivate students to learn about something, maybe spark their curiosity, discover something for themselves, which again is really like what you were talking about. Maybe predict the outcome of a demo or experiment before we actually show them the experiment, or assess what they're already thinking. Then during instruction to really help develop students' knowledge about something new. So it's not that you're just trying to find out what they already know, you're teaching them something, and the questions are part of the instruction. It's not just the assessment, it's part of them wrestling with the concepts and coming to terms with them. So you can just be sort of checking their knowledge, which is something we talked about, or, you know, it gets more and more complicated, you know, from trying to apply something, apply an idea to a particular situation, maybe evaluate what they think about something or whether or not a particular technique is appropriate. Synthesis, exercising a skill, or, you know, drawing out a misconception so that they can realize that they need to change their thinking. So there's a lot of different things you can do during instruction, and I think that you know, we often think too much about the after instruction part, and it's important, but questions can be a way to learn too. So then after, to assess learning, this is also really important. You can have students relate what they just learned to the big picture or to other material that they've learned. You know, review or recap what you've talked about to sort of make sure that the big messages came through. You can do an exit poll. I like those a lot. Sort of, you know, get students to once again reflect on what they've learned during that particular lecture and come away with one of the big messages. And I think that demonstrating success is really important, not just to indicate to the students, not just to indicate to you whether or not you students got it, but also for the students to realize I made progress in my learning in this lecture. You know, it's important not to have, you know, all the questions too easy, but as you indicated too, you don't want them also so sort of difficult or challenging that you never feel like you kind of got somewhere. So those demonstrating success questions I think are really important. Clickers are just one tool for questioning. So you want to think about how you're questioning. It's not like this little thing is going to be some magic bullet to help you completely transform your class. It all depends on how you use it. So don't confuse the pedagogy with the technology. This is the technology. The pedagogy is just the question asking, and that's why I showed you 3 different technologies for asking questions: raising hands, colored cards, and clickers. They're just different technologies, but think about how it is that you want to use that technology. And just to sort of highlight something that, you know, what I'll be talking about in the next workshop if you guys come, is the perfect question doesn't solve all problems. Just asking the perfect question doesn't necessarily lead to, you know, happy, joyful classroom. It can, but there are some finer points of facilitation that can be really useful in making this work. We have a series of videos on our website. I'm just going to show you a little bit of one of them to show what we mean by peer instruction, so you can see what it looks like in the class.
But just what is a clicker? Clickers are basically a real-time poll of your class. Let's give you a brief snapshot of how it's run. Several times in each lecture, the instructor pauses and asks the class a challenging question on the material.
I think the greatest challenge for the instructor is to write meaningful questions.
If the hamstring muscle is stretched, what do you think would be the effect of reciprocal inhibition? So up till now, we've talked about the stretch reflex in the starting in the quadriceps. This is now about the hamstring.
Well-formulated clicker question should make you think, and it should make you address the concept at hand, but it shouldn't be too tedious or laughably simple, because that's just a waste of time.
Students chat with their neighbors for a few minutes to help them figure out the answer.
I think I learn better when I talk to other people around me. There's something about debating and in a sense teaching other people when you think you've got the right answer, or learning from other people when they've got the right answer, that's really helpful in that learning process.
Students are learning more and more deeply when they're figuring things out for themselves.
And if it was at the end of the molecule, you needed to do a workup with water because it would make it salt. Oh, right, but we're not going to do that. But it's in the middle, so it's not going to be. Okay. So D looks like the best answer.
You can do the same thing with a cloud of gas. You can measure the Doppler shift of that. What is M2? Asking you what mass is M2 measuring?
So you're saying that the gravity will
take
pull some of
about
the stars
15,
away,
20
possibly,
seconds
from the other
to
one?
click in your answer, please.
That sounds legit to me. All right.
And then they click in with their choice. Instructors can get a record of every student's answer. A real-time histogram is created, showing the class response as a whole.
So there's a pretty strong agreement on E, none of the above, but I got some B's and C's. B is very tempting.
Okay, so Max said he narrowed it down to B or D because he knew that when you stretch the hamstring, you'll want to functionally...
The instructor discusses the question with the class and moves on from there.
Same way and hit. What if they're spinning opposite ways and hit? I'll tell you.
I think the more a teacher will facilitate conversation after the clicker question is ended, the more effective it is.
So we have, like I say, some other videos. One of them is using clickers effectively, which is a 15-minute detailed video about all the different pieces. So that's also a useful resource for going to find ideas about facilitation. So we sort of have this anatomy of a clicker question that we just saw, where you ask students a question. They might vote on their own. It depends on the instructor whether or not they have them vote individually first. But they have students talk to their neighbors, do this peer discussion part, and then vote, and then have a whole class wrap up. So this is the process that we mean when we say Mazur's method of peer instruction that I asked if you were familiar with in the beginning. So I'm going to give us a chance to ask questions about that whole process, but I want to get into it a little bit more first. So what's sort of special about clicker questions? What is it that this tool gains us? It gains us a few things. Really, clicker questions are similar in terms of goals from other questions. So just any verbal question I might throw out to the class, I would say I've got similar goals for my students with that kind of question as I do with a clicker question. They tend to be multiple choice. You can ask some alphanumeric entry questions now with iClicker, but most clicker questions are multiple choice. But here's where they're really different. They're anonymous. Anonymous to the peers, not necessarily to you. You can look back at students' records to find out how they answered a particular question, so you can give credit and stuff like that. But in the moment, it feels very anonymous, and so it's a bit safer. Every student has a chance to participate, even if it's just through the little click of the button. So even the ones that wouldn't necessarily raise their hands to answer your question that you pose verbally during class are getting a chance to think about the question and put in their response. There's a forced wait time. You know what wait time is? That's wait time. That was wait time. Usually we don't wait long enough after asking a question before we prompt or give an answer or give our thoughts on it. And it feels longer when you're standing in front of the class to, throw out a question and there's silence. The thing is that silence is the time during which students are processing the question. And we usually jump in. In fact, I think that studies have shown that students start to process the science questions after about 4 to 5 seconds. That feels like a long time when you're standing in front of the class. Here's what 5 seconds feels like. You probably don't usually let silences that long go by in class typically, unless you're having students think about something with a clicker question. So clicker questions force a wait time because there is that delay during which students are voting and thinking. And this is, I think, really important. You can withhold that answer. People might blurt out what they think, but you can withhold your expert opinion until all the votes are in and the whole discussion has happened. So I don't usually show the histogram until after we've had a rich discussion. So these are some benefits of using the clicker tool that I think make it really powerful. But let's think more generally about the kinds of questions that we want to ask. If we look back at that sort of set of different clicker goals, which one of these could be clicker questions? Or are there any of these that could not be clicker questions? The one that I think is really difficult to ask a clicker question of, sometimes you can make it work, but a true synthesis question where you're asking people to put something together to make something new is kind of hard to ask in a multiple choice format, simply because you're giving them choices to choose from, and so it's not going to be completely creative out of their heads. All of these kinds of things, which you would typically use as questions on quizzes or verbal questions in class could be clicker questions. So let's give it a quick try just so that we can see what it's like. I want you to think about what answer is your favorite answer before you start chatting. Think about which answer you would choose. And now turn and talk to your neighbors and discuss why your answer is the very best one. So I'd usually give you about 2 minutes to discuss this. So this is sort of the accelerated process. This is such a predictable question. So one way to facilitate the discussion is to start just, would somebody like to share what they answered and why? You just voted. Tell me what you voted and why. Okay, so we're influenced by gravity. Here's another way I could solicit some answers. Let's look at B. Even if you didn't answer B, why might B be a tempting answer? Why might somebody choose B? Good critical thinking question is to think about why somebody would choose an answer that you didn't choose, especially if it's like, conceptual question. So I can solicit answers for, these different choices, and we can end up having a rich discussion, which ends up allowing us to talk about, the effects of all of these different forces. Why might we use this question? Why or when? To provoke thinking. Okay, so to
it's not
get
like facts or anything. It's an opinion.
It's kind of light and silly, so it's good to have that at the beginning of class to kind of loosen people up and get them to focus, but not in it.
Yeah, and it's actually a question that's used in the beginning of the semester by a physics instructor I know for that reason, to get students loosened up about answering clicker questions in general. Here's an example question. I'll give you a chance to read it. And this, by the way, is a technique I recommend in your class, not necessarily reading your question aloud to your students, because then the auditory stream is kind of interfering with the visual stream. Just give them a chance to read it and process it. I read through it slowly while I'm having you read it to feel like I've given you enough time. So what about this? What's the goal of this question, or when might you use it? It's a probability question. maybe assessing whether or not they've got it, but they probably haven't been taught this exact question. So this is probably actually a chance for them to really wrestle with what, God, it's been a while since I've done my math. Would this be independent events? Yeah, probability of independent events. To see that they can apply that abstraction to a specific case. And usually college professors do pretty well with this question. I'll give you the answer. It's one girl and one boy, because there's 2 ways to get that, girl boy or boy girl. But the high school teachers that I give this question to consistently cannot reason through it, and that's probably a good litmus of what a lot of college freshmen are struggling with in terms of mathematics understanding. So any overall questions on this process before we really delve into writing questions?
I guess one thing that I noticed about that last question, where the question about the twins, is that I stopped reading when I got to the question mark and went to the answers, and I started having this whole party in my head about, fraternal, identical, which are more likely? Well, it depends on the and it just got into a whole other thing. And I'm wondering how many students have a tendency to do that, and only after thinking about it for a little while did I notice that it was answered after the question mark. So this was probably a case of me skimming, getting to the question, and then immediately starting to try and answer it before I had taken in all the information. So I'm wondering if in a good question, you put all the information at the beginning, and the question is the last thing the students read to make sure they don't miss anything.
One thing oftentimes too is that students stop reading when they get to what they think is the right answer choice. So that raises the question of whether or not you want to put the right answer choice typically towards the end. Students will start to game onto it if you always do that. But we try to make it so that the answer choices are so tempting that you have to read through each one, that it's not that easy to reason through, and they have to actually think about each answer choice in order to answer the question. Using those different goals of questions, I want you to choose one of those question goals. It doesn't matter which one. Just choose one that, sort of draws you, and those are the, possible question goals here. And just write a draft question that aims to achieve that goal. Write 4 or 5 distractors. This doesn't have to be perfect. We're going to be workshopping it during the rest of the workshop. But just take 3 minutes, on your own to try to write a draft question that's aimed at a specific goal. Probably easiest to think about a course you're currently teaching. Talk about. So, a few question writing tips. First, I want to hear from you guys. What are some things that have worked well or you think would work well in terms of tips? We already heard write good distractors, like writing those wrong answers is difficult. What's another tip, something that you think would make your clicker questions in general better?
I think particularly when trying to assess prior knowledge, which is the kind of question that I tried to write, it's possible, like if you're testing how somebody did the reading, it's helpful, I think, then in particular to write good distractors or good alternate answers, because it discerns students who just skimmed and happen to recognize a phrase and go with it from students who read carefully and are able to really distinguish exactly what the answer to the question is.
Nice. So let me give you a few of the tips that I've got, some of which you guys came up with. Move away from simple quizzes. Like those are the questions that are easiest to write, but they have limited function. Using questions that really prompt discussion. Now, the critical thinking questions that you guys were talking about are really important for having that sort of, giving students a chance to think through a topic. You also want to have an eye towards it being a discussion, a question that people really want to discuss. Something they can't really answer on their own, maybe sparks their curiosity, and they need their neighbor to help them figure it out. You guys already mentioned this, questions that emphasize reasoning or process. Using clear wording. This is something that usually comes over time. You write a question, you think it's perfectly clear, people are like, huh? And then you revise it for next time. So, sometimes having a colleague read over it and make sure that it makes sense to them is a useful thing. Tempting distractors, and we'll talk about some ways to come up with those. Questions in a mixture of cognitive depth. So the question that Mark came up with is a really high level of cognitive depth, but it's a deep question, this sort of synthesis thing. A factual quiz is a low level of depth. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but things you do want a little bit of a mixture, again, so that students feel that they have some success with the questions and they're not just all brain teasers, but if they're all easy, then it's kind of a waste of time. Challenging questions, not just memorized facts. So coming up with believable distractors. There are a couple of tips that we've got for coming up with those wrong answers. One is, talking to instructors who have taught the course before, like what are the things that students often think? Or if you've taught this class before, just sitting and looking over your materials and realizing what kinds of wrong, sort of erroneous thinking students often came in with. Talking to your students can be a really good way. Just be like, how do you think this works? Can give you a lot of insight into what kinds of things you might write into your distractors. This one I really, really like. Ask homework and exam questions, or look back over last year's homework and exam questions. What did students tend to get wrong, and what did they write? There are your distractors right there. And I think that that's one that people use the most when trying to write their distractors. Asking your students to come up with answers that will be used as choices. So you can ask an open-ended question, have them write down some answers, and then you've got a clicker question either for next time or for the next time you teach the course. And lastly, you can use these researched and documented student misconceptions from the literature. There are some really great databases out there that can give you not just the misconceptions, but also questions that are based on those misconceptions. AAAS has a really nice assessment website that has some of those. You can also, of course, find pre-written questions, and we'll talk about some sources for those. So here's an example question. I'll give you a chance to read it. This actually, I don't think is a good question. Students can just pattern match and look for that word tilt, and they're like, oh yeah, I remember the tilt was something important. And they don't necessarily have to understand what it means. So it looks sort of like a conceptual question, but it's kind of a factual recall in disguise. So we can make a better question on that same topic. Here's a rewritten version. So you have to really understand in order to predict what will happen if the orbit was changed. You have to, these sort of prediction questions, I think, can really get at the meat of whether or not a student understands a concept. So I want you to use what we've just talked about. I'll give you five minutes for this to start rewriting your question using what we just talked about in tips. If you have time, if you want, swap with your neighbor and discuss what you're working on in your question. So we've talked about some tips for writing questions. I also want to talk about the sort of cognitive depth of questions, which is something I alluded to before. This is something that's called Bloom's Taxonomy. I've got this in your handout, so don't worry about the words. But it's basically a sort of ascending pyramid from sort of the low-level skills of like remembering and understanding up to applying something, analyzing, evaluating, and creating or synthesizing. So you can think, this is a way to think about the different questions that you've got, and you might notice that these categories are very similar to some of the goals that I had. You can see that there's sort of these higher order and lower order type of categories. And I think this is just a useful way to think about your questions, to make sure your questions are targeting the kind of depth that you want your students to achieve. So you guys are all pretty on board with like asking questions that really get students to think. But this is a way of thinking in an even more detailed way about just how your students, how your questions are challenging your students. If you look at that green sheet, this is a sheet of Bloom's Taxonomy, and it's got all of those different levels with different verbs and model questions at that level. And I find this to be a really useful way of thinking about questions. So say that I know I just want to check my students' understanding of something. I'll look to understand and say, what part doesn't fit? Which one of these does not go with this categorization? That would be a good understand question. Or match these two terms and question. If we go to analyze, you'll see the verbs there are classify, compare, differentiate, distinguish. So you can start to think of questions that you could ask to ask students to compare this to that. Differentiate Galaxy A from Galaxy B. Or if you look in the model questions, see what is the function of such and such. These are just really good ways to spark my own thinking about questions. And I use this when I've written a sort of low-level factual question and I know I want to make it harder. I want to get at something deeper. So I call this bloomifying up the level of a question. So I want you to use this sheet now to rate the Bloom's level of the question that you've already written, and then swap with a neighbor, see if you agree on the Bloom's level, and then use the verbs on this handout to bloomify up the level. Even if you've got a high level question, see if you can up it just one level. And there's a place in your handouts to write this. There's this exercise 2. What was the original Bloom's level of your question? Not the new one you're in the process of writing. All over the place, but sort of down. And did anyone go higher than evaluating? Okay. So typically around the first 3, it's where it's easiest to write the questions. This is why I think this process of bloomifying up the level can be really helpful to try to get at some of those higher level questions, which are a lot harder to write. And of course, you can use pre-written questions. Oftentimes, the pre-written questions are also at a low level. This is also why I think it's helpful to be able to think about a question in a different way and tweak it to be a higher level question, so that you can use pre-written questions and as a sort of jumping off point for writing higher level questions. I have a bunch of example question trios up here on the wall. We won't have time to do this completely, but I think this is a really useful exercise. There are pens next to them. What I want you to do is read the questions. You probably won't get to all of them, and just jot down next to them a couple of ideas on how you think that these are similar or what they're trying to get at. So just sort of, write down here like a couple of notes as to any sort of common themes that you see. Type of thing. So just ways to think about questions, different question approaches. I'm going to wrap up real quick. We have a few minutes. So in the workshop, we ran out of time, and so I wanted to go through a few of the slides here separately on video so that you can get a sense of what we do. First off, that gallery walk is a very powerful way to have a chance to look through a lot of different questions. And I suggest that you now look through the questions that you've seen on the screen and think about what they might have in common or when they might be used in your classroom. Looking at example questions is one of the most powerful ways to get a sense of how you can use clicker questions and what kinds of questions you might want to write for your instruction. But I also want to emphasize something I mentioned in the beginning of this workshop, which is that the perfect question does not solve all problems. There is still a lot of facilitation techniques and tips that you might want to consider in order to make this work really smoothly in your classroom. Just putting up a great question doesn't necessarily make this work for you automatically. So I then like to do a question asking participants to think about what the most difficult piece of using peer instruction will be for them. A lot of people feel like writing questions is going to be a really challenging part. Perhaps getting student discussion going is going to be something that will be tricky for them. And it's just good to pause and think about these pieces of peer instruction that might be difficult for you, because then you'll be better prepared when you actually reach one of those experiences in the classroom, and you'll have some ideas up your sleeve. So I like to go through quickly a few best practices and solutions to some common challenges that instructors face when using clickers, because this is we don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about this. We don't have rose-colored glasses on. There are some difficulties and challenges that instructors can face when they try using this in the classroom, particularly for the first time. So I wanted to just prepare you for some of those things. One thing I want to highlight is that these aren't just tips and tricks that I pulled out of thin air. These are ideas that all align with one core underlying philosophy of teaching, which is that it's important for students to discuss their ideas, to feel safe doing so, and it's important for me as the teacher to be aware of those ideas, because those help me better teach my students. So that's the sort of glue holding together all of these different ideas that I'm about to present to you. I have a separate workshop that's all on clicker facilitation, and I go a lot deeper into these ideas in that facilitation workshop. So first, when asking a question, some of the things to keep in mind are that you want to be asking questions mixed in throughout your lecture. That questions shouldn't just be tacked on at the beginning or tacked on at the end. They're an integral part of the lecture. We usually consider like between 3 to 4 questions at a 50-minute lecture to be a good target. As we talked about in this workshop, make sure to ask challenging, meaningful questions that students really want to discuss. And we try to give students time to read the question on their own rather than reading it to them aloud while they're reading it on the screen, because otherwise the audio and the visual streams tend to sort of overlap. Peer discussion. A lot of instructors say, well, I'm not sure how I'm going to get students to talk to each other during these clicker questions. And it's really important to have them talk to each other. This is sort of the meat or the nut of this technique of peer instruction. It's important for students to get a chance to articulate their ideas, to get a chance to learn from and teach their peers, and for you to hear what their ideas are. So that's why it's important to have peer discussion. And so some things that can make this work are to make it clear to students why you're using peer instruction, that this is something that's going to help them learn. I'll show you a brief video after this slide on some ideas on how you can do that, like a spiel that you can use with your students. You also want to circulate throughout the class while they're discussing. Then you can listen to that student conversation. If certain student conversations are stalled, you can ask a probing question to get them to move forward, and you can model what kinds of conversations you want them to be having. Again, it's really important to use questions they want to discuss. Peer discussion doesn't work if there's a question that's too simple that they don't need each other to answer. And you also want to allow enough time, like 2 to 5 minutes is what we usually consider to be a good amount of time. You don't want it to eat up a ton of the class, but you want to give them enough time to process it. And one thing that a lot of people don't necessarily consider is that what you do after the peer discussion is really important for helping the peer discussion part. So if you, in the wrap-up discussion, you're just focused on the right answer and not why the right answer is right or the wrong answer is wrong, students learn that it's about the answer rather than about the reasoning. And so they'll talk about the answer in their peer discussion rather than about the reasoning. So what you do after the peer discussion is really important in helping the peer discussion itself work. So student buy-in is really important. If students don't feel like this is something that they want to participate in or that's going to help them, there's not really much point for them to participate in it. So here's an example of here's some discussion and some examples of how instructors help students to really buy in to peer instruction.
The most important thing for a successful experience for both the students and the instructor is that everybody should buy into it. So the instructor, the very first lecture, should talk to the students about why do we use clickers.
It's absolutely vital that you explain to your students why you're using clickers. And I would repeat the explanation weekly for at least a month. And the reason is students are used to being handed knowledge by the professor. And they don't have enough metacognition or self-knowledge to realize that figuring something out for themselves is valuable. And let's face it, it's more work.
What I'll do is I'll tell them what this is all about. I'll just say, hey, clicker questions are an opportunity for you to understand not what the answer is, but what's the reasoning.
If you think about it, it's always the same students who sit in the front and the same students who sit in the back. And especially for the students in the back of the class, if they wanted to interact with you, they'd be sitting in the front. So you better make it worth their while and explain to them that if they explain things to each other, if they get more actively involved in the class, they're going to learn more and their grade is going to go up. So why are we going to be using clickers in class? It's because learning takes place in your mind, not in mine. I can prepare all these wonderful lectures and you can listen to them and you can convince yourself, oh, I understand it. But maybe you don't. For instance, if you can't take what we've discussed and turn it into plain English and explain it to the person next to you, then you don't really understand it. And we've been doing a lot of experimentation over the past 3 or 4 years. And what we find is unequivocal. If I stop the lecture 3 or 4 or 5 times each class, and I toss you a question that's conceptually challenging, and if I make you explain to your neighbor on your right or your left what you think the answer is, your learning is going to increase. In fact, the important part is that 2 weeks down the line, when I give you an exam, you're going to do 20 or 30% better than if you simply spent your time listening to me. Okay, so it's worth your while to go through these clicker questions and debate them with your neighbors. Now, you might be sitting next to somebody who sounds really confident, and you might let that person do all the talking. If you do that, you lose. We say no brain, no gain. Okay? The learning actually comes during the act of explaining something to someone else. And so if you let John, not to pick on you, John, do all the explaining, then John is going to get better exam grade than you are. So it's worth your while to be engaged in each one of these clicker questions. We know very solidly that if you do this, your grades are going to go up, but that's totally up to you.
Lastly, the wrap-up discussion, when you as the whole class discuss what the right answer is and why. It's really important to really respect the student ideas that come up in this discussion, because if students feel like their ideas are belittled or that they made a fool of themselves, they're going to be less willing to bring up ideas in future discussions. So establishing a culture of respect and a climate where it's really friendly to just share your thinking and brainstorming is important. It's another reason why it's important not to offer too many points for getting the right answer in a clicker question, because then that makes it a free, open space for discussion rather than about getting the right answer. If you don't show the histogram right away, that can be a good thing because it kind of keeps the mystery about what the right answer is. If you withhold that histogram of student responses, then you can hear student voices and reasoning about all the different answer choices before they think that they know what the answer is, because they've seen that histogram. It's also really good to ask lots of students to defend their answers as much as you have time for, and not weigh in on whether you think that's a good answer or not. Just hear them, let them come up, and have that reasoning be the focus of the discussion. And even if you've got 75–80% of the students getting the right answer, I always try to go through at least not just why that right answer is right, but also why some of the common wrong answers are wrong, to make sure to clear up any lingering confusions among the students, even if they're in the minority. And really, once you give that answer, once students think they know what the answer is, that stops them thinking about the question. They think that, check, I've got it, and I don't need to really pay attention to the discussion anymore. So withhold the answer as long as you can in order to really facilitate good discussion. So I also really recommend that instructors take a moment at the end of all of my workshops to write down an action plan on how they'll use the ideas in that workshop in their teaching. So just take a few moments right now, wherever you are, to write down a few thoughts on how you might use ideas in this workshop. We have a lot of different resources at the University of Colorado to help you use clickers. Please check out these links for our videos and instructor guide. Please email us if you have any questions.